day. And he said the same thing with their festivals. He said, allow them to celebrate their festivals, but instead of their festivals being celebrated because of some kind of pagan event or some kind of pagan god, or rather have the festivals, Christianize the festivals, have the festivals centered around the feast day of a saint, or in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or something like this. And so it was a very wise policy and a wise answer by St. Gregory. Now also during this time, not only do we have St. Gregory the Great's efforts to help send missionaries to the English, we also have the rise of the Irish. Now I'm not Irish, as you can tell from my last name, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Irish, but we will talk at least briefly about the Irish, because I know there are people out there that want to know about their ancestors. So we had at this time, around the year 493, St. Patrick dies. And St. Patrick, as we all know, missioned to his native Irish, and within 50 years of his death, the whole island had been converted to the faith. So he was a great, great missionary, converted that island, and that island would go on to become, as one historian called it, the nursery of saints, who play a very important role in the history of the church and Western civilization. The great monastery at Iona was founded at this time in 563. We had monk missionaries from Ireland sailing forth and spreading the gospel regularly during this period of time in the latter part of the 6th century. They went to Scotland, they went to Wales, to Brittany on the continent, and they sailed all over this area in Europe. They sailed even to Iceland, and it's possible that even one, St. Brendan, sailed all the way to the New World. So the Irish were very, very important in terms of spreading the faith and of Ireland being this nursery of saints. And also, the island of Ireland was dotted with monasteries. And the Irish monks not only preserved and continued the faith, but also preserved many manuscripts from classical literature and also the scriptures. So this is the period of time during the Book of Kells and some of these other very intricate scriptures that were created by these Irish monks. So they really, in a certain sense, helped to preserve Western civilization. Now again, as I said, I'm not Irish, so that's all we're going to talk about the Irish. We're going to move on to a more important saint, the Saint Boniface, who went in mission to the Germans. Now, Saint Boniface wasn't German, he was an Englishman, so he at least probably received the patrimony of all the efforts and works of the Irish monks. But Saint Boniface is sent to Germany by Pope Gregory II here in the 8th century, and he establishes Benedictine monasteries throughout German territory. Now when I say Germany, there was at this time no notion that we have of a united Germany. There wasn't one nation that was called Germany. Germany as a whole itself wouldn't be united as a country until the 19th century. Up until that time, it existed as hundreds of little principalities and dukedoms and other kind of small administrative regions. At this time, the time of St. Boniface, Germany is a patchwork of different tribes, all living together, living in different regions of what is today modern Germany, sharing common linguistic elements, but not comprising anything that we know of as a modern Germany. Now, St. Boniface goes to the central region of Germany in a place that's called Thuringia, and there he goes to a small village, the village of Geismar, and he and his companions approach this village on Christmas Eve. And he goes to this village in particular because in this village was a huge oak tree that the pagans worshipped as the oak tree of Thor, the god of thunder. And what they did at this tree was they gathered around it, and they would sacrifice children. They would have human sacrifices, mostly children, at this great oak tree. So St. Boniface knew of this. He knew of this tree. He wanted to go and to confront the pagans and to stop this human sacrifice that was going on at the tree. So he takes his companions, and on the outskirts of the city, or at the village rather, he says, here, pointing down to the oak tree, here is the thunder oak, and here the cross of Christ shall break the hammer of the false god Thor. Now the pagans in this village had boasted that the God of the Christians, the God of St. Boniface, in no way, shape, or form could ever destroy this great, magnificent, huge oak tree of Thor. So St. Boniface set out to prove that boast wrong. So he and his companions walk in the midst of this pagan assembly. He has an axe with him. He takes his axe and he strikes the thunder oak tree of Thor once, the tree cracks and falls down. And behind the thunder oak tree was a small little evergreen tree. And this is what St. Boniface said to the pagans. He points to the evergreen tree and he says, "This little tree, a young child of the forest, shall be your holy tree tonight." Remember, it's Christmas Eve. "It is the wood of peace. It is the sign of an endless life, for its leaves are evergreen. See how it points upward to heaven. Let this be called the tree of the Christ child. Gather about it, not in the wild wood, but in your own homes. There it will shelter no deeds of blood, but loving gifts and rites of kindness." So if you ever wondered where we as Christians get the whole tradition of a Christmas tree at Christmas time, it's from St. Boniface. It's not because there are a lot of evergreen trees hanging out in Bethlehem, right? Or that they're even recorded in the scriptures that there was an evergreen tree in the stable where Jesus was born. It comes from St. Boniface, his destruction of this pagan tree and his conversion of these pagans in central Germany to the faith, giving them, in place of this oak tree, the evergreen tree, to use on Christmas to celebrate the birth of the one true God. And so again, we can see how St. Boniface even adopts the policy enacted long before by Pope St. Gregory on how to mission to the people. And he did cut down the oak tree, but instead he put in place of the oak tree an evergreen tree. So he kept their custom, he kept the festival, but he Christianized it. Instead of worshiping the oak tree and committing human sacrifice at the oak tree, rather they would use the evergreen tree, symbolizing Christ, to acknowledge his one and for all sacrifice for all mankind. So it was just a brilliant move on St. Boniface. It was a great missionary. St. Boniface would ultimately find martyrdom and win the crown of martyrdom in 754 when he was off in what is today Holland in the Netherlands, where he was missioning to people there and was killed along with several of his companions. So we mentioned in the beginning of this time period that not only do we have missionaries, and that's a bright light in the history of the church, but we also have a dark time enveloping the church and Western civilization at this time, and this is the rise of Islam. Islam comes into the picture here in the 7th century. And Islam is founded upon, the whole movement of Islam is founded upon Muhammad, who was born in Mecca in April of 570. Now Muhammad was married to a very wealthy woman, and he actually was her third husband, and she was 15 years older than Muhammad. She exercised a great influence and exerted great influence over Muhammad. Now when Muhammad was about 40 years old in the year 610, he was awoken from a sleep in a cave near Mecca. And he was awoken by a heavenly voice that told him he was the messenger of God. Now he was terrified at the voice and of this experience, and he actually thought that he was possessed by some kind of evil spirit, and he contemplated committing suicide. It was such a terrifying and unnerving experience for him. He continued, the figure appears though again and tells him that he is the Archangel Gabriel, and that Muhammad is supposed to be the messenger of God. And so he receives these revelations from supposedly the Archangel Gabriel for 3 years. And he keeps them hidden. He does not make any of these revelations public outside of a small circle of initial followers. He told his wife, and he told his adopted son, his 10-year-old cousin, and a close friend. So for these 3 years, the followers of Muhammad are this very, very small, tight-knit group. Eventually, in the year 613, he is told to make his revelations public. So he does. Now, we have to understand the situation of the Arabian Peninsula at this time. The Arabian Peninsula was full of a bunch of numerous different tribes. There was no unified tribe or no unified nation or unified community on the Arabian Peninsula at this time. There was a large Jewish population present in Arabia, and there were also Christians, although I put quotes around the term Christian because the only Christians who were there believed and practiced Nestorianism and monophysitism, both of these heresies that we had talked about. So Nestorius, again, denying that Mary was the mother of God and believing that there were two persons of Jesus, and then the monophysites who believed that he only had a divine nature and wasn't both true God and true man. So Muhammad knew of Christian teaching, but the Christian teaching that he knew of was warped and distorted. It was a heretical form of the faith. Now what Muhammad taught was he taught that there was no God but Allah, and that Muhammad himself is his prophet. Now the interesting thing about Allah is that Allah was known as a god in the Arabian Peninsula. The tribes who comprised the Arabian Peninsula were polytheistic. They believed in a multitude of gods. And even the big black box that we see in Mecca, the Kaaba, actually was a shrine that held idols to 360 gods that the people in Arabia at this time worshipped. Now there was one god known to the Arabian people who didn't have an idol in the Kaaba, and that god was known as Allah. So he was known. So what Muhammad did was not anything new and unique in terms of announcing that there was a God and his name is Allah. What he did, though, is that his revolutionary move was to take Allah and put him in a position of primacy. To say that all these other gods that we supposedly worship are false gods. There is only one true God, and it is that one God, Allah. And not only is there just one true God, but we owe all of our submission, the submission of our entire will, is to that one God. Which is where we get the word for his movement, Islam. Islam means submission of your will, of you to God's will, to Allah's will. It does not mean, as many people think in our modern culture, say peace. Rather, Islam means submission to the will of Allah. He also taught that there should be a community of believers. He taught this whole dichotomy between those who believed as he did and believed in Islam and those who were outside of the community. So he constructed this whole notion of a community of believers, whom he termed the Ummah, and then the community of those outside the believers. And it was the house of Islam, the house of the community, and the house of war, those outside of the house of Islam, outside of the community. And so the proper orientation for the community of believers to the house of war was one of struggle, and one of violent struggle at that. He preached this whole notion of jihad, of going forth and of taking those who were in the house of war and forcibly bringing them into the community of believers. Now initially the Meccans, when they heard of his teachings, they viewed his teachings with indifference in the beginning. But soon they became upset because he became much more militant in his teachings. He went so far as to ridicule them for their worship of these other gods, and the fact that their ancestors were in eternal damnation because they worshipped these false gods. So he upset the Meccans. He ultimately had to flee Mecca, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in the year 620, Muslims believe that Muhammad had a miraculous journey where he traveled from Mecca to Jerusalem, this is called the night journey, where he was taken up from Mecca to Jerusalem, where he ascended into heaven from the Temple Mount. And while he was in heaven, he met with many of the prophets, including Adam, Joseph, Moses, Abraham, and supposedly he even met in heaven and talked with Jesus. Now this is the reason why Muslims believe Jerusalem to be such a holy place and a holy site. Not that Muhammad actually necessarily physically went there, although they believe that he did, that he was taken up miraculously from Mecca and went to Jerusalem and ascended into heaven. Now, Jerusalem at this time was obviously not under Islamic control, but they believe in this miraculous journey, and so therefore it is a holy city for them. Now, 2 years after this night journey, he has to flee Mecca and go to live in the city of Medina. This is known as the Hijra, or the flight of Muhammad. And it's from the Hijra, from his flight from Mecca to Medina, when the Islamic calendar begins. Interestingly enough, the Islamic calendar doesn't start in the year in which Muhammad received his revelations. Rather, it starts in the year in which he fled from Mecca and established this community in Medina. Now, while he was in Medina, his revelations became much more militant, and he himself even became a military leader and a warrior. He actually personally led raids against caravans that were going on to Mecca and began to try to bring all the other tribes in the peninsula under his sphere of influence. In 624, he attacked a convoy during the pagan holy month in which it was forbidden to shed blood. So the tribes in Arabia had actually come together and decided there would be 1 month a year where they wouldn't attack each other's convoys, that you would avoid bloodshed in that year, or in that month. And Muhammad and his followers sallied forth from Medina and attacked this convoy. And he claimed that he was able to do that. He actually had a lot of criticism for doing that, even among his own followers. But he claimed that he had a revelation from Allah, which allowed him to undertake such a raid. Now, it was a huge event because it sets this pattern that we see in Islam, that you can identify good with anything that benefits Islam. If it benefits Islam, it's good. And so there's this understanding, there's this kind of warped, in a certain sense, morality when it comes to dealing with Islam. That there's no set, defined kind of objective morality. It's whatever it is that Allah has revealed, through Muhammad, through the Quran, and also through the sayings of Muhammad in the Hadith. Now, eventually, in the year 630, Muhammad conquers the city of Mecca without a serious fight. Ever since he fled from Mecca, he had been trying to consolidate his power and trying to control Mecca. Eventually, he is able to walk into the city and claim it. Now, it's interesting to take a minute and just study Muhammad's personal life, some of the facts of his personal life. He ultimately, through his life, had 14 wives. His favorite wife was a 9-year-old. Now, he actually married her when she was 6, but he waited until she was 9 to actually consummate the marriage. Now, he was very young. He was in his 50s when he married his 9-year-old wife. Now, this whole practice of marrying young girls is actually still alive and still practiced in Islam today. Now, I know many of us probably remember the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran during the late 1970s and 1980s. And he was the spiritual leader of the movement, the Islamic Revolutionary Movement, which overthrew the Shah and established this Islamic Republic, which our country is dealing with today. And so the Ayatollah Khomeini, when he was 28 years old, married a 10-year-old girl. And the legal age for marriage in Iran today for a girl is 9. So it's perfectly legal to marry a 9-year-old in Iran, no matter what your age is. Muhammad also would go on to marry one of his 14 wives was his daughter-in-law, his adopted son's wife. He received the revelation from Allah, which told him that he could take this his adopted son's wife, his daughter-in-law, as his own wife. He was a very ruthless man. He ordered assassinations for those who were against him, who criticized him, both politically and personally. If you criticize Muhammad for his political beliefs or for his activity, you were liable to be assassinated. If you criticized him for his personal behavior, you also could be liable to assassination. He famously had 3 poets assassinated because they had written poems unfavorably about him. One was a woman who was murdered in her bed while she was sleeping with her 5 children. So Muhammad was not a man that you necessarily messed with. He had a certain orientation, and he saw himself as a warrior, really, as a messenger of God, but as kind of an armed messenger of God. He died in the year 632, and in his farewell address before he died, he told his followers to fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah. Fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah. We can contrast that with the teachings and the last words of Christ. Right? When Christ ascended into heaven, what did he say to his apostles? He told them to go, therefore, make disciples, teach the nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Right? Muhammad, some of his last words to his followers were, fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah. So this whole understanding of Islam being oriented towards an imperialistic policy, to a venture of always going out and trying to conquer territory, has existed from the very beginning of Islam. It's wrapped up in the very notion and very beliefs of her founder. And this is something that we will deal with throughout the rest of the time periods in our history and study of the church, where the church and Western civilization is going to be continually attacked by Islam. And it's a movement that we are still dealing with today. So for us to really understand what it is that we're dealing with in the West, we have to understand the foundation and the beginnings and even the personal life of the founder, the Prophet Muhammad. Now, in your workbook, we have a map which shows you the effects of Muhammad's expansionary ideal. that his understanding that there was this house of Islam and then the house of war. And the house of Islam's job was to go out and to bring those who weren't in that community into the community